Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. My apologies for the technical glitch. So I'm Nizam. I'm from Sparx Systems. I'm the Director of Enterprise Solutions. And today we're going to have a session presented by the experts at the Ministry of Defense on how they transformed architecture implementation and engagement at the UK Ministry of Defense. In a world where there's a whole raft of new technologies and disruptions and geopolitical events, the gentlemen here are going to explain how information management is quite essential for enabling stakeholders to succeed. And they will also be going through in detail how they implemented the Sparx architecture platform and enhance accessibility and usability of this architecture information to the larger stakeholders. I'm excited to introduce the speakers. I'm going to be joined by Gus, Harry, and Rowan, who are the senior architects at the UK Ministry of Defense, who worked on it right from scratch and implemented it through various challenges and got the incredible stakeholder buy-in. So I'm excited, as you are, to gain some insights on how these experts use the Sparx architecture platform to transform the operations, enhance collaboration, and drive project success. With that said, I would like to invite the team from Ministry of Defense to present their screen and enlighten us on this. Over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Agustin Martin-Mena, but everyone calls me Gus, much easier. One of the information architects here at the UK Ministry of Defence, in particular working for the British Army. And I basically look after the Sparx environment and run the architecture review boards. With me, as was mentioned, I have Harry and Rowan. Harry.
So my name is Harry Kelly, Junior Technical Architect and working in the Ministry of Defence. I've been working alongside Gus and Rowan for about a year, again helping with how the Sparx system works with ourselves.
Brilliant. And finally, my name is Rowan Parker Jervis. So I am currently the enterprise architect, working through the Army's land training test and reference capability, or its collective training transformation program, a multi-billion-pound program that we are using to transform the way in which we deliver training to our soldiers. Now, for those who could see my image, you'll also notice I am a soldier in my spare time, an Army reservist within the Royal Corps of Signals. And we've been invited here today to talk you all through how within the UK Ministry of Defence, we've really looked to transform architecture engagement. And the first thing to really get after is, what do we mean by architecture engagement? And what we mean by that is, how can we get away from ultimately what many architects have to go through, justifying themselves to their stakeholders and customers? It's a consistent challenge where you regularly have to justify the purpose of your role, because many stakeholders don't really understand why architecture and modelling is so key to understanding, be it an enterprise, system, programme or project. It's critically very hard to often enable stakeholders to look at a model, be it an ArchiMate, UAFML, BPMN, and them to understand really what you mean by what you expressed with that model and essentially what you're representing. So today we're going to talk through how we've really transformed architecture engagement. We've changed the game. So enterprise architects no longer just have to be that focal point for questions, but instead stakeholders and customers can access the models themselves and almost treat them like digital libraries, where you go to the model to interrogate it to understand what's going on, as opposed to constantly having to interrogate the enterprise architect, who in many respects almost becomes like a back-end developer who just puts together the model and based off feedback updates it to ensure it remains current. Now we've applied industry standards. Of course, you'll all be familiar with TOGAF. The NATO architecture framework, both for UAFP, but ArchiMate also, dependent on user needs, and really considered the involvement of those standards through life, because that is something we are really keen on ensuring that we comply with, because we are not just looking at this internally with a mod, we are of course constantly trying to consider our partners, allies across NATO to make sure that our architectures are interoperable. And again, it all drives back to that architecture engagement piece, but the sorts of models we are putting together are not just for those stakeholders directly within Army, Air, Maritime or across mods, but for all sorts of individuals across a joint domain, where we need to share these both to industry, to many of the different contractors that we bring in to deliver these systems, but also those partner nations. Okay, so we're going to start off with a discussion around meta, okay, where we've implemented practice, we've conformed with those standards, we've introduced training and developed model-driven generation technologies, profiles that really allow us to transform the way in which we develop our models and deliver them for our stakeholders. We're then going to show you how we've used one of those model-driven generation technologies to develop a mission thread and make it accessible using Prolaborate. And alongside that, a second example, taking us away from that sort of military capability domain over to representing IT systems, which of course the Ministry of Defence is heavily reliant upon. So looking at meta, one of the first things that we've really got after in transforming architecture engagement is that realm of building culture. Culture is critical when it comes to architectural modeling. We need to show our stakeholders why it is so valuable that we develop these models, and of course, how they can interrogate them themselves. So we put together a lot of introductory dashboards, much like this one, which are just sort of show in many respects why architecture is useful and some of the develop some of that understanding behind its purpose. And so one of the key things that we always brief when we build culture is ultimately within defence, we are looking to move away from analog documents, spreadsheets, PowerPoints to digital applications, which are underpinned ultimately by databases. We want to move all that information out of those analog artifacts into central repositories, which are discoverable, accessible, and can be used for the benefit of development systems of enterprises. We consistently highlight that one of those key applications we really see right now within the Ministry of Defence is Sparx Enterprise Architect. Ultimately, is a key tool to reconfigure the data in those potentially SQL databases, but then allow you to truly understand the design of a program, system, or enterprise. A typical analogy we often use, because our one stars often get confused when we talk about architecture, that we refer to buildings, and we say in many respects an enterprise is quite similar. You know, a house can be decomposed into its materials, architectural design. Much the same, an enterprise within an army can be decomposed into its parts, which can include anything from a role, facility to application. And we've then used the model to trace and show how those different elements relate to one another. Of course, throughout applying industry standards, with that absolutely critical standard being the NATO architecture framework. Though worth noting, we are seriously looking at and applying the unified architecture framework modeling language with that, and particularly looking at the framework, UAF, that comes along with it to really expand and make sure we are conforming with best practice. Okay, and the key thing you'll see here is this isn't a typical diagram you see when you present a model to someone. Typically, you know, you might see ArchiMate, of course, which we'll use as the modeling language to talk you through today our approach. But instead of showing them an ArchiMate model, we've looked to move away from that and instead just treat ArchiMate like a back-end language, something to develop models, but not to present them. We take this lexicon of different elements that exist within the notation and convert them over to rich pictures, much like this one. And we'll talk you through today how we've achieved that. And this really has been absolutely critical to our success in moving away from those documents, PowerPoints and spreadsheets. And you'll see right now I'm presenting off Prolaborate. Again, I personally rarely will ever present off PowerPoint. I will rarely actually write a Word report. We typically also use the document generation features within Sparx itself to actually generate those reports. So again, we can consistently move away from them. Now, it's been highlighted, again, we are very interested in ensuring we conform with standards. So the two that we are most interested in, ultimately our TOGAF, and realistically, the utmost importance, because we're always interested in interoperability with partners, is the NATO architecture framework. So we've put together two meta models for the notations ArchiMate and UAFP, or UAFML, depending on the term you prefer, to show how all the different architects across the Ministry of Defence can conform with the NATO architecture framework. And you'll see here, you can open up all these different viewpoints to have a look at and ensure you are compliant with the standard. I'm sure many of you on this call today are very familiar with it. We, in essence, have just captured the UAFP DMM, which is published by NATO, and have ported it into this tool to produce an overarching meta model here to show the different elements that can exist in the model and how they can relate to one another. Now, we're not going to go through this in too much detail because, again, it's very much that meta structure, and we want to show you how we've actually applied it. But just so, again, you can have that flavor, we've also completed the same for ArchiMate, and in essence, allowed both of them to almost work in tandem. So you have that choice. In time, we may look to restrict to conform where we would like to reduce to one notation to simplify things. But at this stage, again, we want to make sure we're open and offering all the standards that are available to our practitioners. And you can see here, so a similar meta model, but for ArchiMate. But again, both of those meta models usable with a NATO architecture framework. Now, something else to really highlight here, and this goes back to practice. One of the other key things that we'd be getting after is training. Now, training is an interesting one. We are training up architects, we're training up civil servants, we're training up soldiers to be able to develop these models. But one thing we do not believe is that we should be training up those individuals that will develop those models, because you'll typically find a one-star or two-star officer who needs to access these models simply doesn't have the time to wrap their head around ArchiMate. They don't have their time to work out how to use Prolaborate. They need to get this information quickly so they can make decisions. So you'll see here, we've set up Prolaborate in such a way with these icons to make it look and feel much like an iPhone or Android, because you'll typically find when someone buys a new mobile phone, they don't need to go through a training course or receive a training manual to use it. And we want to make sure that our models that represent our architecture can be treated in much the same way. But of course, we have put together training to ensure that we can rapidly upskill those individuals that will actually develop those models to ensure they are compliant and accessible. And that training includes running through the basic concepts, understanding those key notations that we're interested in, how to apply the frameworks appropriately, and of course, getting your head around meta, because we do often find individuals really struggle typically to understand the whole premise of what meta actually means. Using that, we then have basic training materials. And again, I'm just showing you the landing page for these, but you can click through them for understanding UML, wrapping your head around SysML, and similarly for UAFML and ArchiMate. And then finally, interactive diagrams, so you can understand potentially UAF when you get to that stage, so you can really develop models that are compliant. And again, you could click on each of these, you could dig through to really get your head around that framework, because again, we don't want people having to go and read the documents provided by OMG. We want to give access to that information at a much quicker, faster point of requirement. Now, once that training's been completed, we then don't want individuals to go into ArchiMate and have to spend a lot of time ensuring that they are compliant, constantly checking what relationships exist between or can exist between different elements. Because of course, when you use ArchiMate with Sparx CA, it does offer you the entirety of Open Group's published meta model. So we produce two module-driven generation technologies to complement those meta models that we have developed. One for UAFML and one for ArchiMate. But where we've seen real utility in this and power, and we're going to give you a live demo using Sparx CA in a second, is that we have built in lots of metadata tags and, even more importantly, lots of graphics to represent our different models. You'll have to give this one a second because we have quite a few different bits of equipment, as I'm sure you can understand across mods. We built in all of these different graphics to our MDG, and this is an ever-expanding catalogue to ensure that our users can actually start to rapidly build models, but don't necessarily rely upon the notation. It's still ArchiMate in the background, but when you actually use the MDG, it converts it through to something much more powerful. Now, we're going to give you a very brief live demo of this. Here. So I've loaded in our ArchiMate profile. Again, we could show you the same for UAFML. And essentially, we've expanded certain ArchiMate elements, stereotypes, into more specific relevant stereotypes for defense. So, for example, one of those things is army officers as a role. Again, you have a choice of all these different elements here, but we'll stick with officer for now. Within that, we've applied lots of different metadata tags. For example, you may want to change the rank of your officer. So you can see here, you can apply all those different ranks. We built in lots of different facilities. So you might want to represent offices or bases, outposts, FOBs. Okay, you can see here, you could choose from that huge catalogue. You may want to choose different vehicles, and we have quite a significant vehicle catalogue because the Army fleet is quite significant. But you'll notice with this one, when I click it, it still remains in ArchiMate because we have also added a feature which allows you to rapidly convert between ArchiMate and the graphic, depending on your stakeholders. And of course, we've written JavaScript scripts to complement this. So if you want to convert from ArchiMate to the graphics quickly, you can do that indeed. And you'll also see from the metadata tags, we've got lots of other stuff built into here. For example, different owners, so we can rapidly identify who potentially owns this system. Different security classifications, so we no longer classify by document, but we literally classify down to the detailed elements, which makes it much easier for us to share open source or official data, as opposed to potentially one paragraph in a document, elevating that information to official, sensitive, or even secret, and then restricting our ability to distribute it. We've used a mixture of graphics and also, when it comes to stuff like networks, different shape scripts to represent different types of network. You'll see here there's a whole host of different things that you can introduce. And I think that really gives you a flavour of this in action. Something else we also really like is the ability to develop task orgs. So we've built into our MDG the ability to represent task orgs, or at least formation units, using the NATO standard. So again, you could see here, we could choose engineer potentially to represent one of these NATO symbols. You could apply different flashes in the bottom right-hand corner. So we could change this depending on who owns it, whether it's AHQ, it belongs to a brigade, battle group. You could choose different sizes. So we might say this is a corps. Again, you can see here changing the arm, all sorts of different things to reformat this element using the shape script that's built in. But one thing we have retained, and you'll see this in the top right-hand corner, is still trying to ensure that our stakeholders have a rough flavour of that notation, because we're still keen to have a familiarity with ArchiMate. So you can see in the top right-hand corner, it still includes that ArchiMate logo or icon, so they have a flavour of what we're trying to actually get after with this. Okay, back to the actual Prolaborate dashboard. So that gives you a flavour of how we put together this MDG, which has really unlocked so much potential in getting Army officers really bought into what we present to them. So they really like it. It produces dashboards which are friendly, feels like they're using their mobile phone. They actually can use this on their mobile phone if they have modnet connected devices. And they can actually load it up. And if they're at a conference and they need to quickly something about a specific system, then they can search it and get to grips with potentially which vendor has produced it, what processes are being completed in support of it. One example of this is putting together mission threads. We are incredibly interested within the Ministry of Defence on the development and delivery of mission threads using modelling approaches, and again, getting away from bulky documents to try to elaborate what we expect a unit to do. So we can represent a concept of operations here using a capability hierarchy. So we might be interested in a battle group, and again, you can use the nested pie functionality built into Prolaborate to access the model and show where all those different capabilities will specialize into what we're critically trying to deliver with that concept. Using that task org functionality, we could build out sophisticated task orgs for entire battle groups, you can see here. And really useful, build in metadata tags to then extract and build charts with respect to those task orgs. So the commander could potentially understand what the breakdown of forces is, where different units are potentially located, or the classification of which those units are operating at. And what is really powerful here is ultimately this builds a catalogue up of all those different units, which they can then draw upon down the line. We could show operational rich pictures, because often the commander wants to have an overview of potentially how everything ties together, where they tie back to base to those deployed elements, using these nice graphics of soldiers, tanks, devices, to show how everything links together, because we're really interested within the Ministry of Defence around interoperability and integration. And critically, when you build in these links, you can use those interfaces to identify where specific standards apply to them, either DEF stands, STANAGs, ISOs, IEEE's catalogue of different standards. So we really get after how we deliver these different components to ensure that they can talk to one another. We could build out equipment catalogues much like this one. And I really should highlight here that this is, of course, all dummy data. So not a live representation, but just an example of how we use this platform to really represent potentially to an officer or battle group commander the equipment available to them. and importantly, which different parts of a unit are using what. So you can see here again, the nested pie functionality should show the README component of a battle group is using these different bits of equipment. Potentially also charts like this one to show the number of different assets that are available to them. And of course, again, you could click on each of these different assets and then identify through traceability who is using what, which I'm sure, again, you're familiar with. Add details about each of those different bits of equipment, thus building out a true library and wealth of information about all that is available to you in the delivery of a mission. We can map out activity, and something we've built into our MDG is the ability to use ArchiMate with sequence diagrams. And that's something we really love about Sparx EA, is the fact that it offers so much flexibility. A lot of other tools, particularly ArchiMate tools or pure ArchiMate tools, will not allow you to develop sequence diagrams with the notation. Because something we also find incredibly powerful are activity diagrams, particularly flow diagrams. And you'll see here the flow of a battle group as it goes through the process of attacking an objective. And again, Sparx EA offers this functionality, so you can open up that process and really show from the start point to the end point all those different actions that will take place. And finally, something that is incredibly powerful and useful, and we've used it here to represent the matrix of a mission thread. So where those different units will be going through their planning cycles, delivery cycles, using the lifecycle configuration. And again, the MDG is critical, so you can actually use this lifecycle configuration with Sparx EA. Of course, we've used this for lots of different things, both for mission threads, but also showing where vehicles come in and out of service, or applications come in and out of service. And it becomes incredibly useful, again, as an interactive dashboard, to then bring up that metadata to show all that matters to potentially that event that might take place as we work through this timeline. Now that's shown you how we use this tool for the mission thread example, which again is incredibly important because Army is, or mod as a whole, is quite different to we typically find other users potentially as Sparx EA, where we're not just interested in IT. You know, architectural modeling is very much often focused in IT, but we use it for a broader lens for military capability delivery, model-based systems engineering, all sorts of different elements in ensuring that we can both bring those systems to life in delivery of the capability that the Ministry of Defence wants to achieve, but also ensuring that we can actually understand that digital backbone in our IT architecture. And you'll often find it's very similar in nature, the way in which we use the tool for these two different things. So when we talk about digital models, so representing IT architecture, much like you might have a catalogue of all those different systems, we find obviously you could do the same thing with building out an application catalogue. So we've built in a whole wealth of different application components, and I'll quickly show you an example of using that with Sparx EA. So if we go up to application component here, you can access this whole catalog here of these different applications, potentially to demonstrate different graphics that we find Army officers can relate to readily. And you can also then show where they apply to potentially different servers. And again, instead of having a node for a server, you have a nice graphic, much like this one, which means that we find then those non-technical stakeholders, those one-stars that are interested in potentially what applications are hosted where and what is available to them is readily available so they can make use of it. We really like this new feature that Prolaborate's added in. These diagrams are really helpful in us identifying potential APIs that exist between our different applications. Again, I really should highlight that this is just a bit of dummy data. These aren't actual APIs. So you may look at this and say, oh, I don't think that exists. It doesn't. It's just to show you a flavour of how we're using this, because we do have a copy of it, obviously, within the Ministry of Defence, but for our live applications that have been deployed, to show how they integrate into a wider landscape with relevant and respective data architecture, to show where different data fields flow in and out of those applications. And again, that becomes incredibly powerful in understanding how your IT architecture ties together. We're We're obviously very interested again, and this is much like the last example, in those rich pictures in representing how different roles across defence use those applications. And I showed you previously the ability to add in officers, add in naval officers, civilians for to work in defence, and then apply those different applications to them. Again, all conforming with that MDG, so applying the standards that we've laid out to our architects. And again, much like the other demonstrations we've shown you, we've built in the ability to add actors for different domains. And again, you can apply those different formation flashes to show where the actor belongs. And similarly, we have that for organizations. So both of these, including the formation, are just extensions of the ArchiMate physical business actor in this case, or when we use UAFML, an extension of the UAFML post. We could then take all those roles and build out hierarchies. And again, dummy data here, we have a much more extensive hierarchy of all the roles and organizations that exist across defence. And this is something that we find we get immediate buy-in from those 1 and 2 stars. They're always really interested in what is the breakdown of all those individuals that potentially matter to my enterprise. What will the workforce look like? And again, they really struggle with the ArchiMate notation, but they look at this and it makes sense. Okay, it converts it over to something that's usable, so they can then work out where all those different actors will be assigned to roles in the delivery of the enterprise, in the development of a system, the system itself. And then also, importantly, again, using the functionality that Prolaborate is introduced to show where different individuals, actors engage with one another. It's actually quite easy typically to identify from an application catalog where APIs exist. We find typically that's not too difficult. What's incredibly hard to understand is where we've got lots of different officers from the tri-service where they engage and talk with one another. And these diagrams here are incredibly helpful in showing potentially we have an RAF officer that interfaces with these different individuals and how they interface, so we can keep track of all the different communication that's going on as we look to integrate all of defence. Requirements is something we find incredibly interesting. Often Sparx isn't seen as the tool to use for potentially requirements management. People turn to DAWs, NG, or they might use Dementias. We actually personally find that Sparx has some really powerful requirements management features. And we typically actually like to use Sparx now for the management of those requirements. We find the audit features built into Sparx powerful in tracking what changes are made. I haven't filled in any of these again because it's dummy data, but it allows us to then capture all that metadata that applies to our requirements. But importantly, instead of the typical functionality that's offered by other applications, the difference here is we can build dashboards that really bring meaning to our stakeholders because they look at this and it makes sense. Whereas when they see a long list, it can be quite challenging to relate. Or we can, of course, build these requirements into rich pictures, which can become incredibly powerful in then really showing to our stakeholders where these different requirements actually matter with respect to potentially a system, an organization, or an application. Now, something we are really interested in, and we have lots of challenges within defence, is identifying capability gaps. So we find the nested pie incredibly powerful for this. I've shown an example here with an actual gap. We often use JavaScript with metadata dates built in to colour where capability gaps appear. And essentially what we could show is capability taxonomies with potentially requirements which will realise those capabilities and identify potentially in the instance of this communication capability that there is a requirement gap and we need to get after identifying a requirement that will ensure that this gap does not continue to exist. And we also then derive this out to a third level typically where we will identify potentially systems that these requirements then realise, or systems that realise these requirements, I should say, to really show when a system comes in out of service, that requirement will then cease to be, I guess you'd say, necessary. Now we're on a bit of a journey here. It's not, you can't switch to this overnight. It takes time to persuade a stakeholder to move from documents, PowerPoint, spreadsheets into this system. It is far superior, but we have to persuade them. And one of the ways we've actually done that is started to move the registry of our documents from SharePoint onto systems like Prolaborate. So instead of having those documents built into or accessed via SharePoint. You instead store them on them, and you can then access a dashboard much like this one. Click on it, and it gives you a link through to that document wherever it's hosted on SharePoint. Now, this is a sort of temporary measure because obviously we're trying to get them away from SharePoint. This is almost a lure, tempt them onto this system instead. This is the first point of call instead of going straight to SharePoint and access your information here. What we're slowly doing is also then building those documents into the Sparx CA Pro Cloud Server database so we can directly preview them in the application. Again, I've had to show you dummy data today, but we actually now have live documents built into the database that are dynamic. So where we have lots of different content changing in the model, it automatically updates these documents, which you can then access directly from the Prolaborate tool, which becomes incredibly powerful in really moving all those different stakeholders off their disaggregated data sets into one central system. Again, all that metadata allows you to build different charts to understand those documents, which is incredibly pertinent and powerful. And finally, one of the things that we found really useful is Prolaborate Sparx is great to design enterprise systems, deliver them. But of course, you need to use project management tools alongside them to actually track what everybody's doing, to make sure that they are conforming, they are actually getting after what we need them to. Again, really powerful that Prolaborate offers those integration features with the likes of Jira, Azure DevOps. Within Army, our choice has been Azure DevOps, but we are actually seeing across a wider mod that we typically also now use both ADO and Jira. So the integration features of this application, Prolaborate with these tools, is incredibly useful. And this allows us to then open up DevOps, and we can then use the integration of this tool here to allow us to link up different elements with those that exist in ADO. So we generate tokens here for those integrated application projects to allow us to tie those two things together and then directly open up all those elements to show how they link from ADO through to Prolaborate, which becomes incredibly powerful when it comes to program and project management, to track who's doing what to make sure that your design is being delivered. And really, all of this together, particularly that MDG, is allowing us to move all this data, and I say data, I really refer to all these documents, spreadsheets, and PowerPoints that contain all this information relevant to defence into one central repository for mod. Truly allowing us to integrate all of defence by getting our stakeholders to buy into this incredibly powerful application. That's the end of our presentation, but we're really keen to get some questions. We're, of course, more than happy to go through the MDG in a bit more slow time to show you how it's been developed, built. And we're really keen to look to help you potentially understand and use this, particularly also for anybody working in the defence sphere on this call or domain, helping you conform with these standards, because we are critically making sure that anybody who is involved within the mod enterprise does conform to the NATO architecture framework. So again, we can continue to integrate and interoperate with our partners and allies.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. It was great. We have quite a number of questions to you. We'll try to go through them as time permits, but are you okay if I can just read out the questions and you try to answer them?
Yes, of course. Please do.
Okay, so the first question was from Crystal. So how do you ensure systems are compliant with the standards? Do you have an automated process to ensure compliance?
Yes, so we have again we're very much reliant on the JavaScript functionality offered by Sparx CA. So we've built in a bunch of JavaScripts that allow us to automatically check compliance. Now, obviously, the great thing about the MDG is it kind of enforces it. If you put in a relationship that's not allowed between two elements, when you use the MDG, it kind of forces you down that route. So, for example, if we go back to this tool here, you could see, as opposed to the full ArchiMate meta model, you can only have an assignment between a business actor and a business role, which is what we've specified in our meta model. So it's not a massive issue. But if we do get someone that introduces a new relationship, we do have JavaScript that we can run on a repository to check its conformance. Also check how many metadata tags have been filled in, which of those that we deem mandatory haven't been completed. Really making sure that we automate what used to be quite a mandrolic task. And of course, allowing us, when we get to requirements verification, making sure that full traceability is in place from whatever has delivered that requirement. But it essentially was laid out in our motivation.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's more or less a follow-up question, but this is from John Gladson. So he says, it is in my experience that without a well-defined modeling methodology, which takes the capabilities of the tool into account, it's hard to develop models consistently. So to what extent have these challenges been addressed?
Yes, it's a really good point. It's really hard, particularly if you're working in a discipline of potentially more than 5 architects. So the key thing that we've laid out with our standards is methodology. So, for example, if you want to apply UAFP with the NATO architecture framework, we've put together process diagrams to show how you should work through the development of a NATO architecture framework compliant model. Critically, of course, showing that it isn't a one diagram per viewpoint for the model, but just examples of how you should apply it and how you should step through it. So we typically find that enterprises develop a common architecture roadmap. And we have this again for both UAFP and also for TOGAF. Well, actually, if I go back, it's on the front page. Yeah, so if you open up each of these diagrams, it really shows the methodology that you need to apply in using the MDG. So if we open up, say, like phase B of the business architecture, the flow of steps through those different viewpoints that we find are incredibly powerful in developing compliant and useful models that everybody can ultimately work with.
Thanks. So firstly, like everyone in this audience, including me, would agree that this is one of the best MDGs we would have come across, and that has been seen in a lot of comments across, including Phil Chudley himself, who is the guru with MDG from our knowledge. But there's a question which says, are there any plans for MOD to make this MDG available to allow suppliers to support architecture efforts?
I think that is actually something we'd really like to do. Yeah, absolutely. Give us a bit more time. We just need to get the right sign off so we can release it. But we'd like to think that this will be available via our government website in the very near future, both a copy of the UAFML one, UAFML, and the ArchiMate one. So yeah, hopefully very soon they will be available for you to download and make use of yourselves, along with also pretty much all of this material in how to apply the standards and how to use the methodology. So all of this in our eyes is open source, and we should be making available in the not too distant future when it relates to meta content.
We just need to get the appropriate sign off, that's all.
Yes. I'm the enthusiastic architect. Gus is the one that actually makes sure that this gets reviewed properly, and so hopefully in time.
You could see the kind of excitement in the audience. So that is an amazing news, and that'll be incredibly helpful for a lot of people here. So there's thank you so much for that. It's highly appreciated. So we've got there's a whole lot of comments along the MDG, but like Sabrina has, I think, pretty much along the same lines. How did you translate the complex technical designs in simple user designs?
Oh, this is a really good question. I wish I could show you some live models. Obviously, I can't because of the nature of this call. And potentially that's something to follow up on us with, because we may be able to do that dependent on the level of your clearance or who you work for. We, in essence, you have to treat the model as a sort of, again, this backend database that has all the complexity in it, but it's just a catalogue of information, and you can reuse those components in different ways to draw out diagrams to present different meaning to stakeholders. I showed you that rich picture before here for the mission threads. I believe it's an operation. Yes, here. Okay, but obviously there's a lot more detail behind the scenes as to how potentially the it ties together, and you'll find in our actual live models you'll have this you'll have the model of the WIMIT. And you can then open it up, and it takes you inside to actually understand the complex technical detail. Now, it doesn't here because I can't show that in the case of this demonstration, but that in essence is how we use the model. We almost create typically like catalog pages, but you can then open up if you want to understand that technical complexity, or of course, also use the traceability that Prolaborate or Sparx and Prolaborate offers in tandem to really get into the weeds of how that thing ties together and all those different attributes. So it really is almost taking that catalog, producing something really simple, but then giving the option for stakeholders to dig down if they need to. And obviously, 1 and 2 stars don't have enough time, so they typically don't. But the technical architects need to actually understand, what does this thing actually decompose into, so it can talk to another radio. What does that actually look like?
Thank you so much. Just I wanted to share to the audience the kind of efforts that the team has invested just for this case study. So this is pretty much at least 2 months that the team has tried to create a desensitivized model to present in this case study. It's an incredible effort from the team. So firstly, I would like to appreciate that effort. And this question would come to anyone. So I've been with Sparx. This is my 20th year with Sparx, and this is one of the best implementations of an MDG that I've seen. And like there's a question along the same lines which says, it looks very good. And how long did it take? And how many modelers were involved to get something like this? And how many modelers are involved to keep the repository updated?
It's kind of just, well, in terms of developing the MDG, it's just me, Rowan. So yeah, I just sort of, I guess you'd say I've put this together over the last year. If you ask me to put this together now from afresh, probably take no more than a month. You could probably get it smashed out in maybe even a few weeks, potentially in a push, if it was the only thing I was working on. Obviously, it took a long time. What was difficult was to agree with how we apply the standards to make sure that we have meta models that everybody agrees with. That was hard. Once you have the meta model in place, actually, the SDK that Sparx offers is actually really easy to get your head around. There's some great videos on YouTube that I watched, and after watching those that have been put together by Sparx, you typically find actually it's not too challenging to get these together. Now, there obviously is an element of graphic design, and there's an element of actually learning ShapeScript. ShapeScript is quite an easy language to wrap your head around, except for the fact, of course, there's not a lot of Stack Overflow out there for you to refer to. So it's a bit of trial by error. But it's, I would say it's been an individual. As I say, in this case, just myself putting the MDG together, putting together all these meta models, these methodologies. That's pretty much just myself. But I say an individual, Gus and myself. Gus has really been, and I should have put down his efforts because he's actually reviewed all of this. And sometimes it's easier to develop it than it actually is to review it, because reviewing it is almost the more painful element. I get to do all the fun stuff, and he gets to do the boring stuff of reviewing it and then persuading his bosses that it's correct, to make sure that everybody is in agreement.
And what I'd add there is that obviously Rowan's ran off with it and made it look great. And I was saying, can we simplify this? Can we simplify that? And that's why we then had lots of pull down menus rather than having 100 tanks or however many there are. It was a tank, and then from the pull down, you select the right one. Whether he selected the right image after that, I don't know, but hopefully he did.
So it's, I guess what we're getting at there is it would be quite easy to put another one together because we have that lived experience. And also, I guess you'd also say we also face a significant challenge within mods where we are dealing with, there's over 100,000 individuals employed by this organisation. So getting agreement across that scale of organisation is much more challenging than if you worked in a company of, say, several hundred people.
The other thing I'd add, obviously, is that we would welcome probably some collaboration with others, so as to sort of like further develop this, because obviously 2 people working on this can take it so far. There's going to be mistakes, there's going to be things we haven't thought about, but this is good to go. The stakeholders love it because we're not using ArchiMate language, which they don't understand. We're using images that they see in PowerPoint slides, etc., that they do understand with all the right relationships. And that's basically what sold it. We're talking to them in a language they understand, but behind the scenes, we're leveraging the power of architecture.
Oh, that's incredible. I'll share all the comments in an email to you, to all 3. But it's like just appreciation from most of them. I think it's an incredible effort. So I guess just to reiterate what you said, I think there's a lot of teams from different defense organizations who have joined this webinar, and your invite to them to kind of join and build this is something that I would like to reemphasize, and we'll send this as a message to the attendees as well. But it's something that is going to take take the teams who would like to start to a point where there's 80% of it already done, and they can just build it from there. So this is great work. So there are some technical questions as well. So there's a question where Stephen is saying, I've written ShapeScript. Have you found any external tools which can help design them rather than the inbuilt tool?
I think you've just been programming from scratch, haven't you? You found no tools that can help. There's no AI at the moment that can help us do some of this.
To write the scripts, yeah, not really. I mean, yeah, it is just writing all the shape script from scratch. As I say, there's very little to refer to. If you're talking about using tools to actually develop the graphics themselves, if I'm completely honest with you, basically I just use PowerPoint in many respects to put together a graphic. I'll go find a relevant image from a source that we're allowed to use, and then generate that graphic. But it does depend. I try to use, so for example here, this is purely shape script. So we don't actually use any graphics. For example, this one is, whereas these other ones here, or that's purely shape script, but like this one here is a graphic built in. As a tool that we have used for that is VBS4. For those in the world of modeling and simulation, training simulation, you may be familiar with VBS, which is an incredibly powerful simulation tool, but includes a wealth of graphics that you can then build in. And again, the land training test and reference capability working at Army is incredibly involved with the team at VBS or BISIM, who deliver VBS4 to then build in all these graphics to make them usable to mod.
I've also noticed a question further down that says, is this Sparx EA on cloud or on-prem? For obvious reasons, we don't use the cloud version because our architecture has to be sort of like restricted and protected. So we use Sparx EA and Prolaborate on-prem at the moment.
Yep. Thank you once again. So there is one common theme amongst many questions, which is coming back to what challenges are you facing in keeping the model up to date?
I think really the only challenge actually is trust. It's basically getting enough trust from a stakeholder, but we never have to constantly update it. The key thing we're trying to get after is for the soldiers update this. We put the element in and then they go fill in the metadata. And as soon as they access an element and the metadata is wrong, the data is wrong, then they lose trust. And that ultimately is the biggest challenge, because then they won't keep on updating it and it becomes a vicious cycle of failure. And so really it is consistently having that trust. Now, obviously we use scripts to the greatest of our advantage to keep it up to date. We are now starting to use AI with this tool. So an element of DNS, a part of mods, have actually used AI to auto-generate models that they can then import into Sparx. We are also using other AI features to help fill in the metadata tags, which we then have to tailor ourselves to ensure that they are correct. And I'll say, yeah, once we have that trust in place with a model, it's self-perpetuating and ensuring that it stays up to date and is correct.
The other reason for doing it this way is to get them, rather than use PowerPoint, to actually come and build their models in Sparx EA itself, in a way that, as long as the graphics are correct, they can then do the relationships and add all the information they require. And of course, because there's multi-channel publishing, they can then sort of like output that to Word or output that to PowerPoint. But at least they can then reuse it, whereas PowerPoint and Word traditionally can't really be that reused. Whereas if you did an exercise, let's say this year, and you do a similar exercise next year, you can just pull out last year's exercise, change it however you need to, and then hit the publishing buttons again. But we are slowly getting more and more engagement from, let's call them our staff, into using these tools because of the power of what Prolaborate can then expose analytically.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks once again. So there are quite a few questions along integrations, which I think it's technical. Maybe we as a Sparx team can answer them as well. But there was one question where Defense Digital uses BizDesign for all its EA models. Are you able to integrate? Have you faced that kind of a situation here?
Yes, so we have actually been exchanging via the XML between ourselves, so that Defence can reuse architecture and make sure that we incorporate and integrate correctly. So there is a lot of exchanging models within Defence, the UK Defence, between different systems.
Excellent. Thank you. And from our experience as well, so there are most of these tools which has powerful REST API support, and Sparx has a REST API support as well. So there's a lot of integrations that's possible as well. So I guess I'm just going through this. So this again, like, appreciation. And is there? So there is a question where is the AI component on-prem as well?
The DNS one is, I believe.
The DNS one, yeah, they're using AI on-prem to generate those models. But I would have to go to them to give you.
DNS are another part of the Ministry of Defence. They're busy.
Okay.
Looking at capabilities going forward.
We regularly engage with them, and we could certainly, if you have more questions around the AI features that we're using within mods, we could certainly put you in touch and answer those questions.
Okay, thanks. So there are some interesting questions again. So there's a question on change management. Again, a couple of questions on change management. So how do you do the as-is and to-be models currently? So there are some new ways like the time-aware modeling and RAS, but how do you use it in your practice?
Typically, it's using as ADO. So if you want to change an element, you have a respective Kanban board that has those elements, and you have to use that to make those changes, and then metadata tags to work out when something goes from approved potentially or proposed to implemented. And also, we are starting to use the version control, which allows you to show how a model transitions. We haven't put a demo of that today together, but we do use it elsewhere, where you often have 3 different repositories with different versions of the model to show those transition states.
Just a follow-up question on that. Like there's a specific feature like Martin is asking, which is time-aware modeling. Do you use this?
I've not come across time-aware modeling. I'll be really interested, because if it's a feature I haven't used, I'm always really excited to use it. So actually, maybe you could get in touch with us and help us out, because we'd be really interested to learn about that.
Sure, we can, we can share more information on that to you. Thank you. So there's a question from Rocca, where you mentioned managing requirements through EA. Do you then do anything to link or validate design and code against those requirements?
Oh yes, absolutely. So typically, again, I can't show it on here, but we will have those requirements linked to potentially services, different applications, processes, and these will trace through the whole model to verify whether or not a requirement with the respective metadata has been complied with and realized. Again, I'll need to show you an actual demo of that. We can't do that today, but we do typically find, so the requirements almost sit right at the top, or just below the capability, so the capability from requirement, and that then derives that everything else that exists in the model. So realistically, everything ties back to those requirements, because remaining compliant with requirements is always key.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was all great. So there are quite a few other very specific technical questions, which we will try to take offline. But given that we have a few more minutes, would you like to summarize or share anything else to the team? So we have the team still listening. So, you mentioned about inviting people to collaborate and extend. Do you want to share a few words?
Yeah, so I guess, or Gus will speak in a second, but if you want to come and visit Mod and you have the right clearances, please do get in touch with us, and Gus could book you in for a visit. We could talk through this in more detail, particularly if you're from industry. We're really keen to engage industry more on this, because we want them to start adopting it as well. So when they produce models that propose new systems for us, we can make use of them. So yeah, please do get in touch. I'd also really just say to everybody, really focus in this day and age on making sure models are accessible. We want to get away from this sort of era where, one, we as architects, we have to justify ourselves, and two, our models are spider webs, so they're inaccessible to our stakeholders. If your stakeholder who doesn't understand architecture can't access your model, then it makes it very tricky for it to truly add value to your organization.
Yeah, I mean, the last thing we want to do is alienate our stakeholders, because the only thing that happens there is projects get cancelled. So we've had to look at this saying, well, they're never going to learn this language. 1 or 2 stars just need to know, is this a go, or is this a stop, or is this a pause? So we thought, well, we discovered by accident that we could reskin Sparx, and then took major advantage of that. And obviously, depending on your industry, you'd be changing that. For if you're retail, obviously we're defense, so tanks and guns, and sort of focus on what is it the stakeholder wants. What we've been trying to do today is share how we've leveraged Sparx Prolaborate to help others. And more importantly, also to sort of keep our stakeholders, develop things faster, cheaper and better. But should anyone want to come and see us, we're obviously here at Army headquarters in the UK. Please get in touch. And as Rowan said, we'll then look into seeing if we can then host you and show you a bit more.
That is so kind of you, and that's excellent. So there are some requests they're requesting your contact details. If you would like to share something, you can share them in the chat. If you're okay, we can email them as well. But the people would like to get in touch with you, and what would be the best way if you could share the emails?
I'd be happy for you to share our emails. Are you right, that right?
Yeah, please do feel free to share our emails. I believe do you have those? We'll email them to you. We'll make sure you have those. We'll email those to you. Please do share them out to anybody who has questions. We're more than happy to hear from anyone.
Sure. Thank you so much. That's great. As this is one of the most active and engaging session that I have hosted or presented. Thank you so much for all the efforts that you have done to share this to the larger audience. When we started this discussion, so I have to give credits to Gillian, who initiated the whole thing. I was quite skeptical. How would we even make the UK Army model as a case study? But the team were so kind. They built a complete desensitized model that was that they can present. Thank you so much once again for doing all this and all your efforts. And we will get back to you with some of these questions and contacts that people want to kind of reach to you for. And thank you everyone for joining the session as well.
If I could just add, I'd like to thank you for having an amazing tool that we've been able to exploit and leverage architecture.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you everyone, and perhaps we'll see some of you soon. Take care.